In the last lecture, we saw how William of Orange forged a grand alliance to thwart Louis XIV in 1697, and how 3 royal deaths led to another showdown in 1702. The resultant war should be retitled the War of the Spanish and English Successions, for much was at stake: the ownership of the Spanish Empire, the future and continued existence of English constitutionalism, and the future and perhaps even the continued existence of Protestantism. In the end, it would be absolutism which would be discredited, with massive repercussions for Europeans and Americans. To review, the principal combatants of the War of the Spanish Succession were, on the French side, France; Castilian Spain, loyal to the Bourbon candidate, Philip or Felipe V, and, from 1703, Bavaria. On the British side, or the Grand Alliance side, England, Scotland, and Ireland; the Dutch Republic; Catalonian Spain, loyal to the Austrian Habsburg candidate, Carlos III; and most of the Holy Roman Empire, including Austria, Prussia, Hanover, and from 1703, Portugal and Savoy. But the War of the Spanish Succession would in fact be a world war, fought in the valleys and forests of North America, where it was known as Queen Anne's War, and on the high seas of the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Caribbean, as well as the plains of Europe. At first, the Grand Alliance moved cautiously. The Continental Allies were still intimidated by the reputation of Louis XIV, and at home, the Queen's ministry had to please a Tory parliament by pursuing a cheaper, blue water strategy. Let the Allies fight it out on the continent, we'll stick to our ships. The stalemate was broken in June of 1704 when Anne's hand-picked Captain General, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, marched south from Flanders and met up with Prince Eugene of Savoy's army marching north from Italy, thus cutting France off from its ally Bavaria. This combined force met a superior French and Bavarian army under the Marshal de Tallard on the 2nd of August 1704 between the villages of Blindheim and Hochstedt on the Danube. Now that date follows the old Julian calendar that the British were still using. The battle began with a British feint to capture the first village. This broke up the French-Bavarian center. Towards the end of the day, Marlborough committed the bulk of his army, throwing 81 squadrons of cavalry against the exhausted enemy lines. For the first time in recent memory, the French army broke and ran for the river. In the end, the Allies killed or captured 30,000 troops, 28 regiments, and 18 generals surrendered. Marlborough actually ran out of carriages to put the generals in. At the end of the day, the Duke, tired but still on horseback, wrote a dispatch to his wife on the back of a tavern bill. "I have not time to say more, but beg you will give my duty to the Queen and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." Blenheim, as the battle came to be called by the British, was indeed a glorious victory, one of the decisive battles of history. It saved Vienna and thus preserved the Grand Alliance. It knocked Bavaria out of the war, thus depriving Louis of his principal ally, and it cost him the flower of the French army. More importantly, Blenheim destroyed the myth that Louis XIV was invincible. Remember, how could you miss it? Louis had cast a long shadow on European politics for half a century. The French army was thought to be unbeatable. Now, for the first time in decades, that army had broken and run from the field of battle. No wonder that Louis XIV forbade the word Hochstedt, as the French referred to the battle, to be, they can't even agree on what to call the thing, to be uttered in the corridors of Versailles. The psychological effect on the Allies, and especially the British side, was just as pronounced. You can almost see them like munchkins coming out of the forest after the Wicked Witch is dead. The British, in particular, had repeatedly embarrassed themselves in military adventures on the continent, but now they were playing with the big boys. Actually, most of the troops at Blenheim were German, but what people remembered was Marlborough's glorious victory. Blenheim marks Britain's coming of age as a European power. A grateful nation, that is the British taxpayer, voted in Whig majorities in the elections of 1705 and 1708, and those Whigs voted enthusiastically for the taxes to support Marlborough's aggressive land war. That support would make possible a series of crushing victories over the French by Marlborough. Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, Malplaquet in 1709, Bouchain in 1710. In 1706, Prince Eugene threw the French out of Italy. After one of these losses, Louis is reputed to have said, "Has God forgotten all I have done for him?" God was kinder to the Sun King in the Spanish theater of war. The British and Catalonians won early victories at Vigo and Gibraltar in 1704, but the preponderance of the Spanish people were Castilians, and they wanted Philip V. They wanted the Bourbon candidate. Castilian, Spanish, and French forces smashed Allied armies at Almanza in 1707 and Brihuega in 1710, but these were just about Louis's only successes. By the winter of 1708-9, Marlborough's victories, a bad harvest, and the sheer expense of fighting the whole of Europe had brought the French peasant to the brink of starvation, and so brought the Sun King to his knees. By 1709, Louis XIV was melting down the silver at Versailles to pay for one more campaign while begging for peace. Nevertheless, the peace negotiations for the Treaty of Utrecht took 5 years. They were opposed by the now minority Whig Party, they'd lost an election in 1710, who demanded, in the face of military reality and the wishes of the majority of the Spanish people, that the hated Bourbon be denied the Spanish throne. The peace was also opposed by most of the Allies who feared that the British would take all the prizes and run. Now, in fact, the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 and the later Treaty of Rastatt, negotiated by the Holy Roman Emperor in 1714, did seem to both the Whigs and the Allies to be a sellout. First, the Duke of Anjou, Louis's grandson, gets to stay on the throne of Spain as Philip V, albeit with the promise that the crowns of Spain and France would never be united in the same person. The Allies got territory, but not as much as Marlborough's and Eugene's crushing victories had led them to expect. The Dutch received a series of forts on their southern border that they could aim the cannon towards France. The Holy Roman Emperor got territory in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, roughly the equivalent of Belgium. Savoy claimed Sicily. Britain got a few small pieces of territory and other concessions: Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson's Bay in Canada, St. Kitts in the Caribbean. Are you starting to see a pattern here? The asiento, the right to sell slaves to the Spanish New World, plus trading rights with the Spanish Empire, and the recognition of the Hanoverian succession, that is a Protestant succession, by Louis XIV. Now, the Whigs had been hoping for a Habsburg Spain and huge swaths of French territory, maybe Canada. They would, when they got back into power in 1714, impeach the Tory negotiating team under Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford. But they shouldn't have done. For the Treaty of Utrecht was in fact a masterpiece of diplomacy, confirming and completing the work of the Revolution of 1688-9 and ensuring British superiority in Europe and beyond for a generation. First, the settlement of Spain could not have been otherwise. The majority of the Spanish people wanted Philip V. But it didn't matter who sat on the throne of Spain, for both Spain and France were exhausted, financially and militarily, after so many years of warfare. Louis XIV would never again challenge the peace of Europe or pose a threat to the English succession. In 1715, he would die, confessing on his deathbed that he had perhaps been too much in love with war. Because Louis had outlived his son and his grandsons apart from Philippe, Louis XIV was succeeded by a 5-year-old boy, his great-grandson, Louis XV, and this kid isn't going to be leading troops into battle anytime soon. Between the new king's age and France's prostrate finances, England's ancient enemy would be in no shape to fight a war for a generation. In the meantime, Britain's territorial acquisitions sealed its status as the greatest trading nation on earth. Gibraltar may be a tiny rock, but its position at the western entrance of the Mediterranean ensures strategic control of that trade. The Canadian territories may have been bleak and remote, but they provided furs and Grand Banks fish to feed and clothe Europe. And of course, they provided more than a foothold in Canada. Britain's Caribbean possessions and dominance of the slave trade would ensure control of the notorious triangular trade in slaves, tobacco, and sugar from the New World. The sugar trade in particular would be the most valuable trade of the 18th century. It was comparable to oil or electronic goods in our own day. Britain had also won entrance to the Spanish trade that Hawkins and Drake had fought for. Now, we're going to touch on the moral implications of all of these trades below. But the money so generated would be plowed into the British economy, and future British war efforts which explains why Britain was going to win 4 of the 5 remaining conflicts with France. Thus did William III, Queen Anne, the Duke of Marlborough, and the Earl of Oxford forge a grand alliance out of a series of really rather pitiful little countries. Thus did they stop the greatest monarch of his time from dominating Europe for 2 generations. Thus did they lay the foundations for 2 centuries of British power. So how exactly did they do it? There's a hint to be found in a story related by Samuel Johnson in his Lives of the Poets, which I think sums up the contrasting attitudes and experiences of the British and the French. Now, to understand the story, you have to remember how Louis financed his wars. He taxed his peasants until they, and so he, ran dry. Remember, too, that Louis had also spent his peasants' money on the magnificent palace at Versailles. Neither William nor Anne could ever just commandeer their subjects' resources like that. Neither could build a great palace because they would have had to go to Parliament to ask permission. Anyway, to get back to the story. At the end of the 9 Years' War, the first of these wars, William III sent the poet and diplomat Matthew Prior to France to negotiate a partition treaty of Spain with Louis XIV. Now, the French diplomats were anxious to show Prior, they were anxious to overawe him. Today, they would have shown him their missiles. The French didn't have any missiles in 1699, 1700. Instead, they showed him around the palace of Versailles. The French knew full well the British monarch did not have a palace to match Versailles, and that he could not exploit his people in the same way because of Parliament's power. They knew further that the British king had spent all his money on fighting their master. So at the end of the tour, they asked Prior, probably with an air of superiority, "Monsieur, what do you think of our master's house?" Prior is said to have replied that it was very nice, but the monuments of my master's actions are to be seen everywhere but his own house. What he meant by that was that his sovereign had found a way to raise money for war without impoverishing his subjects, but rather by making them his partners. He did so through the last 2 variables in this set of lectures, trade and empire. First came trade. From the 17th to the mid-18th century, supremacy in trade had passed back and forth. First from the Spanish, who squandered their New World wealth on war, to the Dutch, also hurt by successive naval wars against the British and French, and then to the French, who were also hurt by the exodus of Huguenot merchants after 1685 and by Louis's endless wars. So by 1680, the British were experiencing a commercial revolution. The American colonial trade produced tobacco, sugar, and it involved the slave trade as well. The East India trade was built on silks, spices, especially pepper, very popular in Europe, and medicines. London became the wealthiest port in Europe, passing Amsterdam. London also became a major banking center and money market. After all, you have to do something with all that cash. Goldsmith bankers flourished. Some of them still exist, Childs and Coutts, for example. Joint stock companies proliferated circa 1700 in London. Now still, when Britain went to war against France, it was still militarily and economically inferior to that country. Britain's population was at best a third the size of France's. These wars were going to be the most expensive in English history to date. They would treble total government expenditure to about £5 million a year in the first one, the 9 Years' War, and then nearly double it again to £7.8 million a year for the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, to give you some sense of scale, average peacetime revenue in Britain was maybe £1.5 million a year. Now, Louis could raise those kinds of funds easily. He had no parliament to deal with. All he did was he simply went to the French peasants and said, "Give me your money." William did have to deal with a parliament, which only reluctantly voted him a land tax, which yielded about £2 million a year. That's not enough. William's regime was falling behind Louis in the money race. Fortunately, William III had an able Chancellor of the Exchequer, maybe the most important person in this course that you've never heard of. His name was Charles Montague. Later, he became Earl and Marquess of Halifax. Montague had a different idea. He was going to tap England's growing commercial wealth, but not by taxes. Parliament was already taxing land and many of the necessities that people needed via the excise tax. Montague worried that if taxes were extended further, he would kill the commercial revolution. Instead, his idea was to get merchants who were benefiting from that revolution, the commercial revolution, to loan large, quick sums to the government voluntarily. Now that should have been a hard sell. English government credit was terrible. Charles II had actually gone bankrupt in 1672. This is the famous stop of the exchequer, in which he had basically told his exchequer, don't pay anybody. And the government's credit was still awful. Remember that William's regime is a revolutionary regime. It's teetering on the brink. It might fall at any time, and it's fighting the most powerful monarch on earth. So Montagu has to offer deals that nobody in their right mind could refuse. First, he starts in 1693 by establishing a permanent fund out of the land tax, the customs, and the excise to service the loans made by the government. In other words, he would guarantee the interest would be paid. Whatever else happened, the interest would be paid. That made lending more attractive. In effect, Montagu is creating a funded national debt. Second, he went to the merchant community and sold them annuities. What he actually does is he goes to the Royal Exchange, which is where the merchants hang out, and he says, look, boys, we need money. We want you to lend it to us. Here's the trick. We make no obligation to pay back the principal. We may pay it off. We may never pay it off. We don't know. But we guarantee that we will pay you 14% interest for a term of years, or, if you so prefer, for your life. Now, what that meant is, if William continued on the throne and the lender lived, he could make many times his initial investment, and that's a rarity in the 17th century. It worked. People snapped these up. Montagu also established government-sponsored lotteries. In 1694, he also sponsored the Bank of England, which acted as a private bank. It made loans and received deposits. It was also an investment opportunity because you could actually buy stock in it. It was a source of loans for the government. In fact, it would be the government's principal source of loans after a while. And it was a sort of Federal Reserve to regulate the money supply. The result of all of these maneuvers was what my Oxford supervisor, P.G.M. Dixon, called a financial revolution. In the short term, the British government raised fabulous sums of money. This is what enabled the Crown to raise and supply its armies in Europe and the Royal Navy at sea, while keeping its allies in the war with subsidies. Daniel Defoe explained it thusly: the longest purse must win. The long-term consequences of the financial revolution were even more far-reaching. In the long run, this wealth produced what the historian John Brewer has called the sinews of power. Britain's central administration grew in size from about 4,000 to over 12,000 offices between 1688 and 1725. That administration, faced with fighting global wars, grew more efficient and professional. The British Treasury weeded out old, corrupt practices like fee-taking and sale of office. It established adequate salaries and pension schemes. It drew up training manuals and handbooks of conduct. These are all hallmarks of modernity. It even began to compile statistics to know what its policies were doing in the country at large. All imply a more professional bureaucracy. There was a constitutional implication to the financial revolution. Since the national debt was self-perpetuating, it would need to be funded annually. It kept going on year after year. Now, only Parliament could authorize that funding, and so Parliament had to be called annually to keep the debt going. And so Parliament became a permanent part of government, meeting for long stretches every year since 1689. And so it can be argued that the financial revolution helped complete the work of the Glorious Revolution in making England a constitutional monarchy. The socioeconomic importance of the financial revolution was that it made investors and the government contractors whose goods were purchased with the money raised very wealthy, very fast. The financial revolution created a new class of men who made their money not off of land and not off of trade, but off of money itself, off of credit. They became known as moneyed men in this period of time. Now, conservatives, mostly Tory country gentlemen, didn't like this. They saw moneyed men as parasites. They made money off of the war. Because they made money not from land itself or even from the sale of goods, but from other money, loans, paper, government bonds and annuities, or even out of thin air, credit itself, there was something not quite right about this. There was something that wasn't legitimate in the eyes of the Tories. Worse, these men owned no land, And yet they were now taken into the government's councils. They had a say in how the country was run. The whole business was revolutionary. A foreign war that most Tory country gentlemen didn't want. A vast government bureaucracy necessary to fight it. A huge national debt contracted to pay for it. High land taxes, which of course hurt those Tory country gentlemen to secure that debt. A novel, even impenetrable financial system necessary to service the debt, and the growing wealth of heretofore unknown upstarts. Every single piece of the financial revolution threatened the landed aristocracy, and therefore threatened what was left of the great chain of being. The old hallmarks of rank and birth and land were counting for less and less. In the new post-revolutionary world, anyone could rise. And so the financial revolution was yet one more force, one more nail in the coffin, destroying the great chain of being in Britain and European society generally. Now, let's see the effect on trade. Let's go back to trade. As a result of all of the new commercial arrangements that were won at Utrecht, as well as the new territories gained, Britain would become the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. That's what Prior meant by the glories of his master's reign being everywhere but his own house. William and Anne enriched their subjects. They didn't make them poorer by the war. Now, as we've seen, British trade boomed during the period of the Commercial Revolution, roughly from 1660 to 1730. It expanded in total gross value from 7.9 million tons in the period 1663 to 69 to about 14.5 million tons from 1721 to 24. British trade was led by the import to British territories and then the re-export to Europe of Caribbean sugar. Sugar was the oil of its day. Who doesn't understand sugar? Everybody in Europe liked sugar. It was lucrative and it was essential to Europeans who wanted to enliven their palates. Annual demand of sugar rose from 26 million pounds, this is for all of Europe in the 1660s, to 42 million pounds by the early 1700s, 93 million pounds by the 1720s. This was followed in terms of volume by American tobacco, furs and saltfish, Indian silks, dyes and spices, Portuguese Madeira and port wine, Spanish oranges, figs and raisins. And as I read these, I want you to imagine all of this being unloaded at the docks in London. Italian olive oils and silks, Middle Eastern coffee, which gave rise to a whole new culture in London and then of Europe, the culture of the coffee house. All these trades were guaranteed and safeguarded by the Navigation Acts, which said that British colonies could only be traded with through British ports and in British ships. They were safeguarded by the provisions of Utrecht and by the power of the Royal Navy. But of course, underpinning it all was the slave trade and the murderous exploitation of Africans in the New World. Large plantations where work by slaves had replaced most of the original settlers in South and Central America and in the Caribbean colonies of Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France by 1700. So the early settlers had small farms, but by 1700 you've got these vast plantations dependent on slave labor. The notorious triangular trade, or the Atlantic system as historians now like to call it, worked like this. European slavers shipped metal goods and textiles to Africa. There, they traded with African chieftains for captives, mostly between the ages of 14 and 35. These people were transported to the New World in appalling conditions at the rate of over 25,000 a year by 1700. Heads were shaved, people were stripped naked, some were branded. They were chained side by side, prostrate, in damp, close, dark holds with no room to stand. Women were routinely raped and beaten. The death rate on the 3-month voyage ranged from 13 to 23%, though that latter number is more for the early period. In other words, they got better at preserving their cargoes by the end of the period, by about 1800. Once sold to a West Indian sugar grower or an American tobacco grower, you were treated like a piece of human machinery. You were given a new name. You were forced to work 15 to 17-hour days in intense heat for minimal rations. The average life expectancy of a slave once they got to the New World was 7 years. The slave owners could work them to death because there was an endless supply of new human machinery. When a person wore out, you simply replaced him or her. House slaves, those chosen to work in the master's house, experienced some human comforts and did better. The tobacco or sugar thus harvested by these people was sent to the East Coast, to American ports for refining. It was then shipped on to London, to Bristol, to Liverpool and Glasgow, etc. Western English ports did particularly well off of these trades. Then, from there it was distributed to the interior of England or to Europe at a considerable markup. Now, there were critics of this system. Most of them were parish churchmen on the ground who saw it for themselves. The Dominican Father Dutetre wrote a 3-volume work attacking slavery in the French West Indian colonies as early as 1667. It was finally completed its publication in 1671. But most leaders of national churches bent over backwards to justify a system that made so many so wealthy. In any case, a good deal of European, especially British and American prosperity in the 18th century was built on the backs of captive Africans or at the expense of Native Americans driven from their lands. Some historians think that the profits from these trades would later bankroll the Industrial Revolution, and so there's a real connection to our times. Certainly, they helped bury the French. British trade produced money, which produced military superiority, which produced victory, which produced colonies, which produced more trade. Put another way, the commercial revolution begat the financial revolution, which begat the victory at Blenheim, which begat the Treaty of Utrecht, which begat an empire, which begat more commerce, and so on. It was a cycle that the British mastered and the French never completely understood. This explains why Britain won most of its wars with France, culminating on the field of Waterloo in 1815. This explains why Britain replaced France as the most powerful country in Europe and built a world-encircling empire in the 18th century. In other words, this entire system helps to explain why we in North America speak English instead of French. It also may help to explain why Britain became the first industrial nation and the richest country on earth for most of the 18th and 19th centuries. That's how they did it. That's why the British had the longest purse. And that's why Prior could stick it to his smug French hosts. Now, admittedly, what Prior did not say was that some of the monuments of his master's actions were cruel and shameful. The Irish Penal Code, the African slave trade, and of course, the destruction of North American civilizations of Native Americans, Indians. I cannot absolve Europeans of this. I cannot absolve the British of this. While Europeans and Britons in particular were forging modern notions of human rights and democracy, they were denying the humanity of millions. And I think that's how it goes. They were devising these rights and these notions of participation, but they limited them to a very narrow group within humanity. This, at the very least, reminds us, there's a sense in this course that we've kind of been rooting for the British. They have constitutionalism, they're moving towards democracy, but no great country in Western civilization is ever entirely the good guys. I can remind you that all the major European powers wanted in on the slave trade. It was the British who won. I can also remind you that the British were the first to have real qualms about it, finally outlawing it in 1807. And that thanks to the commercial and financial revolutions, the system that won in the 18th century was British constitutionalism, not French absolutism. In other words, British constitutionalism would begat the tools of democracy, which would eventually be used by these very oppressed peoples to secure freedom from their British masters, while French absolutism would begat only the turmoil of the French Revolution. Thus, without denigrating the massive human misery created by the Atlantic system, I would argue that the ultimate legacy of the Glorious Revolution and of the Treaty of Utrecht was to lay much of the foundation of much that is good in Western civilization. Let me put it this way. The ultimate implication of British constitutionalism was democracy. And the ultimate implication of democracy is equality, the notion that all men and women are created equal. The slave trade could never survive once that idea triumphed. But first, there were more wars to be fought.